Hi everyone. Today I want to do a quick chat about the latest book that I just finished. It's called Chaucer's Tale, 1386 and the Road to Canterbury by Paul Strohm. This was published by Penguin Books in 2014, and here is the cover. Got a little bit of a glare. Can you see that? Yeah, the cover's kind of, medieval-ish. Got some of the Canterbury Pilgrims down at the bottom, so cover's okay. So, why did I choose to read this? So, for my 2016 TBR, I really wanted a biography, and I'm not much of a biography reader typically. And I ran across this biography, and it's called a microbiography because it's really very short. Something maybe like 300 or 400 pages. So I read this fairly quickly, and it is written, for kind of a general audience. So it's not an academic biography. So it was very easy to read through. And so, since it had this sort of microbiography format, which is focusing on and around this year 1386, which was a pivotal year for Chaucer, then I decided, yeah, I'll put this on my TBR. I did not know a lot about Geoffrey Chaucer. I think I've had the high school experience of the Canterbury Tales, and my high school days were quite a while ago. So I didn't remember a whole lot about the Canterbury Tales, other than just sort of the general, thing about what is the pilgrims on their way to Canterbury, and they all tell stories. And I didn't really remember anything at all about Chaucer's life from high school, so from my little high school exposure to him. So it was really informative to read. So what the book is about basically is this year 1386. So Geoffrey Chaucer, by this time, by 1386, he is in his early 40s, and he is married, has 3 kids, but his wife actually lives away from him. She lives with her sister, who is the mistress of John of Gaunt, who was the uncle of King Richard II, who was the king at the time. And Geoffrey Chaucer had a history of service to the royal household. So through that sort of those connections, his father had been a wine merchant in London, and through these sort of mercantile connections, as well as his connection through the royal household, he gets an appointment in the wool customs, which was sort of a dicey job to have at the time. It was known for being very corrupt. He was the controller, and then there was another person who oversaw the customs. This is the wool that's being exported. Was passed through these custom houses, and they were taxed then before they were shipped out. So he had this job, and he lived in a small apartment over a city gate, Aldgate, in London, and his wife lived in this royal, sort of semi-royal. John of Gaunt was one of the most wealthy people of the era, and powerful as well. And so I think that's extremely interesting, sort of how they didn't live together during these years, and didn't live together anymore. It didn't live together throughout the whole time that I was reading this microbiography, which basically covered about the 10 years previous. Maybe it touched on his earlier life as well, when he was marrying his wife Philippa. But he did mention a few times one of his sons, especially Lewis. He wrote a sort of a scientific treatise for Lewis because he said his little son was interested in science. So I thought that was cool too. Anyway, this year 1386 was really pivotal because there was a lot going on, of course, at the time in London and in the court with Richard II, which I won't go into too many details right now. But through this sort of behind-the-scenes political power struggles and struggles for position and things like that, he eventually just sort of loses this position. that he had at the wool customs that he had for like 12 or 13 years, and he is kicked out of his apartment, which was rent free. He goes from his apartment, then he is elected kind of in a strange way to Parliament. Right after that, he attends Parliament in 1386, in October of 1386, and he didn't really have a lot to do in Parliament. He I don't think is ever known to have been active in this session. This session was very controversial, and Richard II was a very unliked king, disliked king, and I don't know a lot about Richard II as far as the king goes. It sort of makes me want to read the Shakespeare play now, Richard II, because now that I've kind of been exposed in this way to Chaucer and his time, I'm kind of really interested in the other kind of big players of the time. Richard II, John of Gaunt. John's longtime scandalous mistress was Catherine Swynford, who was Chaucer's sister, Chaucer's wife, Philippa's sister. So that's why she lives with them. And ultimately, they do get married after many scandalous years of just being lovers publicly, even though John of Gaunt was married to another person. They do get married, and their children are legitimized and eventually go on to, their descendants eventually go on to become Henry VII, I think. The grandparents of Henry VIII, the Tudor family. So the house of the royal family, I guess even still today, is related to Catherine Swynford's descendants. So I think that's kind of cool too. So anyway, he ends up he does this stint in Parliament, and then when he does this, he is basically homeless. So he goes to Kent, where you don't hear much about him, but he is in the process of writing the Canterbury Tales. He uses this opportunity to then write the Canterbury Tales. So that's basically what the story is about. His wife Philippa dies the following year. She had received a stipend from John of Gaunt, I think, that maybe he had been using to somewhat live off on, but once she's dies, the stipend is no more, and he kind of struggles for money there for a while during this time. But he perseveres, and he ends up striking out in a new literary direction that ultimately, of course, as we all know, basically founded modern English language literature, because previously there wasn't a lot of stuff written in English. The language of the court was actually the language was still used was Latin or Norman French, and then the aristocracy itself spoke French still from the long association with France after 1066 and etc. And so to write in English for an English speaking, English reading audience was really new, and just sort of the way he structured the tales was also really new. So yeah, on to my experience with it. I want to just to segue off of that. I didn't realize that in the medieval time, in this late medieval time, that stories that most reading was done aloud. Like even if you were reading solitaire, alone, people typically read out loud. So they actually spoke the words verbally, and so that really impacted how people wrote. And so the Canterbury Tales are sort of a hybrid between worlds, because there's an audience of the teller of the tale is telling the tale to the audience is within the story itself. It's the other pilgrims, and then the reader is just the observer. So, or you become one of the pilgrims, and so that's sort of a different structure that had been in English before. It's my understanding from this book. I thought that was cool. The other kind of thing I grabbed from it was just this idea of the time that Chaucer lived, and it's got some real cool parallels to our current time. The life was lived really publicly. It made me sort of think about how people complain now about how there's no more privacy. I think that a person from the 14th century, like 1389 or 1386, would maybe be pretty at home with having seeing everybody's business on Facebook and social media, because it seems like that's kind of the way the culture was at the time, and people didn't, like Chaucer's apartment didn't even have a place to prepare food. It was very common in London to not prepare your own food, but to go get, buy bread from street vendors, and you bought food this way, and this is how people ate. So I think a lot of times modern people get all caught up in things changing, and so oh, we don't have privacy anymore, no one's eating at home anymore, and we fail to remember that things have not always been the way they are now, or the way they were recently. In our recent history, that we may only have a remembrance of, this families eating around, preparing a meal and eating it together, but that hasn't always been how things have been structured socially for humans, and that's not even the way, English-speaking humans have always organized themselves, much less cultures all around the world. So I thought that was kind of cool to take notice of. And then another thing was the difference in time, because, the author points out this, in Chaucer's time, he lived right near two different churches, and there were 7 different services throughout the day, and they rang bells. So people, to mark this time, like matins and evensong and prime, and the different services throughout the day marked the day. And then the calendar was marked by feast days, and so the whole circle of time went around the church calendar, basically from Easter to Easter, and so had this circular view of time. And the government also followed this liturgical kind of view of time, and then people also marked the year not as 1386 per se, but as the 9th year of the reign of Richard II, for example, or something like that. They marked it by whoever was the king. And then the year of the reign of that particular king. And so this was transitioning during this year of 1386. The year he went to Parliament, the Parliament actually used clock time instead of, the Parliament that year started at 8 a.m. It started at clock time rather than the traditional time, which was a certain time after the morning service prime. So I thought that was kind of cool, because that, the perception of time and how we keep time really, really would affect, if you stop to think about it, a lot of things in society and how we view time and how we view life in general, our perception of reality in a way. So I think that's really cool. So I'm going to run out of time. There's a lot I could say about this book. It was a very short book, but it was very rich. I did want to touch base. Geoffrey Chaucer, after reading this book, it really made me like him as a person. He just seems like a guy that I would really like, a person that I could really relate to. One of his other books, which is called The House of Fame. In this book, The House of Fame, the story of the House of Fame. I don't know if we can call it a book, but the story of the House of Fame. There's an eagle that's talking to a character, which is Geoffrey Chaucer himself, and the character's name is Geoffrey. And the eagle is really, like lecturing him on what all his faults are. And he tells him, you don't know anything about what's going on in the world. You don't know any gossip. You don't know what's going on in politics. You don't know what's going on in foreign countries. Nothing, you don't know anything about your neighbors. You don't know anything about anything. And then the eagle goes on to say this. He says, "For when your labor is all done, and you've done all your reckonings, you hasten home without delay, and just as dumb as any stone, you sit and read another book, until completely dazed is your look." That sounds like me. I work all day, and then I come home, and really all I want to do is just sort of absorb myself in a book, maybe dabble a little bit in what's going on, but not a whole lot. So I think I could really relate to Geoffrey Chaucer if I were to meet him. So I think I'll stop with that. I did love it. Now I really want to read the Canterbury Tales, so the Canterbury Tales will be appearing on a future TBR of mine, so stay tuned for that. Until next time, see you soon. Bye.